Hi, everybody. This is the third sign of the Gospel of John, and we're going to look today at the healing of the lame man, the paralytic at Bethesda. So I'm just going to read John chapter 5, verses 1 through about 15 or so. Here's what it says. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. And a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that very condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me." Jesus then said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk. Immediately the man became well, and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them. He said, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." That man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. It's a great text there in John chapter 5. We really get to see a lot about who Jesus is, right? And first of all, we want to talk about the fact that there is a continuation of a theme that we've seen already in the book of John. It's the continuation of the theme of water. We get to see over and over again that John seems to be pointing out water is a picture of something good, but it's only that. And what Christ brings is something even better. So we see this theme over and over. Think about the first sign, the changing of water into wine. Or go back to John the Baptist. John the Baptist, he baptizes, he sees Jesus, he says, "Well, there's somebody coming that's better, right? I'm baptizing you with water. He's going to baptize you with the Spirit." And over and over and over, we see this sign, changing water into wine. Water is good. I'm going to make something the best. I'm going to make something better than that. We talked last time about the healing of the royal official's son, but then in the midst of all of that, we also see the woman who is at the well there. And that's that same thing. We recognize that here's a sign of the water, but Jesus brings something better. He even says, "You drink this water, you're going to thirst again. But if you drink of the water that I'm talking about, you'll have life springing up." There's more to what Christ brings. And so we see that theme over and over and over again. Again, this is the third sign. And so as we talk, we want to talk a little bit about what Jesus is trying to accomplish. And where do we see Jesus in this text? So let's look at verse 6 for just a second. Verse 6 says, "When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time in that condition, he said to him, 'Do you wish to get well?'" That's a great question. And remember, when we talk about Jesus's questions, Jesus doesn't ask a question that he doesn't know the answer to. He's already figured out what the answer is. He already knows. He's God. And so when he comes up to the man, that question is for the man. That question is for you and me. Do you want to get well? That's a tough question. And look at how the man answers it, actually. He avoids that just like we often do, right? He's lost hope. He's lost the ability to hope, whatever it is. He's hurting. And instead of saying, "Yes, I want to get well," he starts to go over the rules. And that's the way that we often mask our hurt. We start to go over the rules. So this man says, well, look at again at verse 6 and verse 7. Verse 6, Jesus asks him, "Do you wish to get well?" And then verse 7, the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool." That's not what I asked. "When the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another man steps down before me." So this man is actually going to talk about his hopelessness instead of the possible miraculousness that could be with Jesus, right? He's going to say, "Well, here's why I can't get well. Well, that's not what Jesus asked. Do you want to get well? And sometimes, let's just take that as a lesson, shall we? Sometimes, instead of telling Jesus all of the things that we can't do, maybe Jesus wants simply to hear us say, here's what I want from you. I want you to ask of me. I want you to know what I can do, not what you can't. Right? So he says, here's what I can't do. Jesus asks the question, first of all, do you want to get well? Great question. Now, here's a couple of questions for us. How would you answer that question? How would you reply to Jesus? Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? What's your answer? Question number 2 that we've got. What if you're one of the disciples or onlookers? How would you feel about what's taking place? Would you recognize that in your own life? Or would you be judgmental? What happens? And I think it's really significant, an interesting thing here. We don't see the disciples with Jesus. There's maybe some onlookers. There's obviously a lot of the sick and the hurting all around. In fact, later on, we're going to find out that Jesus bolts somewhere there. The man goes and he takes up his pallet just as Jesus has asked. Takes up his pallet. He begins to walk. He's going around. And in that process, they say, who did this? And we find out that Jesus has actually slipped away in the midst of the crowd, right? So if you were one of the fortunate ones to actually have seen and heard all of this happen, what's your response? What's your response when something like this happens in our church? Do you want to get well? What are you thinking if Jesus is talking to somebody else? And then the last question I've got right there is, what does this question really mean if Jesus does know the answer? Is Jesus talking about spirituality? Is Jesus talking about being able to walk? Is Jesus talking about his faith, not his faith, but the man who is the paralytic at Bethesda, his faith going forth? What is Jesus' thought there? Why does Jesus ask this question? Is he upset? Is he angry with this man? Is he a little bit angry even that the man has said, you know, I don't have any hope? I'm standing right here in front of you. Yes, you do have hope, but you don't see it. What is Jesus thinking? Why does he ask this question? All right, so verse 7, the man assumes that Jesus is talking about a religious practice. He doesn't assume that Jesus is talking about the faith that he needs, or the actual act of forgiveness, the actual act of life-giving or healing, anything like that. He thinks he's talking about a religious. That's why he answers the way that he answers. Once again, let's look at verse 7. The sick man answered, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. Here's why I don't have hope. Not only that, but while I am going, another man steps down before me. So here's why I'm not well accomplished, not the best of everybody around. Here's why I'm the worst. Man, there's no way that somebody would love me because I can't even take care of myself. So the man assumes a completely different thing. But then let's look at verse 11, because here we get to see something really great. Verse 10, actually, so the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, it's the Sabbath. It is not permissible for you to carry your pallet. You remember what happens? He takes his pallet. Jesus says, get up, walk, take your pallet, off you go. And let me just ask that question. Why does Jesus say, take up your pallet? Because that's going to get this kid in trouble, right? The guy takes up his pallet. He doesn't need it anymore. But he takes up his pallet. He begins to walk through the temple. The Jews and the people around say, whoa, wait a second. We've got the rules for the Sabbath. You're breaking one of those rules. And so in verse 10, they just very, very simply describe, it's the Sabbath. You're not permitted to walk with your pallet. And so in verse 11, he says, well, here's why I'm walking with my pallet. He says, he who made me well was the one who said, pick up your pallet and walk. In other words, back in verse 8, he's going to focus on the physical act. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your pallet and walk. And then verse 9, immediately the man began to walk, picked up his pallet, walking through on the Sabbath day. The Jews then say to him, it's not allowed. And so here's his focus. He who made me well was the one who said, I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to work on the Sabbath. It's actually describing his faith, and I think this is a really cool thing. The entrance, the beginning of a really great faith this man has. We go on, though. Pick up your pallet and walk. Verse 13, the man who has healed me did not, or the man rather, who was healed, did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away there in the crowd in that place. And afterwards Jesus found him in the temple, saying, Behold, you have become well, do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. Okay? That's a cool thing. Verse 15 says, the man went away and told the Jews then it was Jesus who made him well. Those are two very interesting answers. You see, the first time he was asked the question, why are you walking on and working on the Sabbath day? His answer was, in verse 11, he who made me well was the one who said, get up and walk. Later on, he's not going to go back and say, it was Jesus that told me to do this work. He's actually just going to focus on the fact that it was Jesus who said, I am made well. Now, that's an interesting thing as well. All right, so a couple of questions when it comes to verses 11 and beyond. First of all, some things must die and some things must live. So who decides in this story what must die and what must live? Right? Jesus is actually performing this healing. He's going to say, your religious beliefs don't matter. The fact that it's a Sabbath day, that doesn't matter. What's really important is found again in verse 14. Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore. Get your faith straight. Be revived. Be made new. This is what I'm actually doing for you. Right? So you've become well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. This is a point of concern that Jesus has. Here's a way that Jesus is actually loving this man. So who decides in this story what must die and what must live? Tradition must die. Who decides that? He must walk and live again. Who decides that? And who decides that in your life, right? That's ultimately the question. That's the way we apply it. And then in verse 13, we see that Jesus has snuck away a follow-up question here, or a few. One, what kind of follow-up happens? Or what happens to the forgiven and what happens to the healed? What happens with this man, for instance? What happens with this man? We find out in the text, he wants desperately to figure out who did this. He walks away. He's obedient. That's fantastic. That's the first part of faith. But after a little while, and especially when he gets those questions, he, just like you and I, he's going to turn around and he's going to say, I've got to find this Jesus. Jesus actually comes and finds him, but I don't know the answers. I don't know why I'm able to walk. I don't know who made me well. And he's got to find out. So, what kind of follow-up happens with the man? He has to figure it out. What kind of follow-up happens with the Jews? They immediately focus on the law instead of what is a beautiful thing, right? This miraculous healing. And instead of focusing on that, they want to focus on the law. The illustration I use all the time is if you're driving down the road and the sun comes up and it's really beautiful, you look at that sunshine and you think, oh, this is in my eyes and it's a distraction and I can't drive as well and I'm going to be late for work and how horrible this is. We've made something really beautiful, sunrise, into something really horrible, right? That's our choice. That's a choice that we make. Now, granted, I wear sunglasses as well and, put the shade down in my Jeep and all of those things. But look at the way that Christ is going to follow up with them. He's going to go back. He's going to talk to this man, this former paralytic. And the paralytic is then going to share his story, Christ's story, with the Jewish people. All right, so how does God follow up? What's the follow-up procedure with the Jewish people? They get to find out, first of all, their choice of follow-up is they want to follow up with, here's what's wrong with the miracle. But Jesus is going to follow up with them and say, here's the end result. I made this man well. I made him well. All right, and the third thing, the follow-up that happens with Jesus. Jesus is going to go out of his way to go back in, engage again with this former paralytic, and he's going to now at this point say, you know what? Don't sin anymore. He's going to not only course correct, but he's going to make this man brand new. Don't sin anymore. Does he believe that this man will never sin? Jesus actually knows his heart. All right, so why does he say that? And that's the question that we get to wrestle with. Why does he say to this man, go and sin no more? And why does he say to you and to me, go and sin no more? So that's the third sign that proves that Jesus is the Savior. He is the Messiah. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. We'll see you on Thursdays at 12 o'clock.